Hello, my dear children. Myself Sujata. Hope you all are doing well. In the last class, we learned about the Russian Empire in 1914, economy and society at the beginning of the 20th century, socialism in Russia, the 1905 revolution, the First World War, and the Russian Empire. In this session, we'll be learning about the February Revolution in Petrograd, post February Revolution, the Revolution of October 1917, what changed after the October Revolution. We learned about the First World War and Russia's failure in both Germany and Austria. The Russian army destroyed crops and buildings to prevent the enemy from being able to live off the land. The situation discredited the government and the Tsar. By the winter of 1916, riots at bread shops were common. Now let us know about the February Revolution in Petrograd. In the winter of 1917, conditions in the capital Petrograd were grim. Grim means very serious. The layout of the city seemed to emphasize the divisions among its people. The workers' quarters and factories were located on the right bank of the river Neva. On the left bank were the fashionable areas, the Winter Palace, and official buildings, including the palace where the Duma met. Duma means the elected consultative parliament. In February 1917, food shortages were deeply felt in the workers' quarters. Parliamentarians, wishing to preserve elected government, were opposed to the Tsar's desire to dissolve the Duma. On 22nd February, a lockout took place at a factory on the right bank. The next day, workers in 50 factories called a strike in sympathy. In many factories, women led the way to strikes. This came to be called the International Women's Day. Demonstrating workers crossed from the factory quarters to the center of the capital, the Nevsky Prospekt. At this stage, no political party was actively organizing the movement. As the fashionable quarters and official buildings were surrounded by workers, the government imposed a curfew. Demonstrators dispersed by the evening, but they came back on the 24th and 25th. The government called out the cavalry and police to keep an eye on them. Now let us see how a Petrograd Soviet was formed. On Sunday, 25th February, the government suspended the Duma. Politicians spoke out against the measure. Demonstrators returned in force to the streets of the left bank on the 26th. On 27th, the police headquarters were ransacked. Ransacked means they caused damage. The streets thronged with people raising slogans about bread, wages, better hours, and democracy. The government tried to control the situation and called out the cavalry once again. However, the cavalry refused to fire on the demonstrators. An officer was shot at the barracks of a regiment, and 3 other regiments mutinied. Mutiny means they refused to obey the orders of a person in authority, voting to join the striking workers. By that evening, soldiers and striking workers had gathered to form a Soviet or council in the same building as the Duma met. This was the Petrograd Soviet. Now let us see how a provisional government was formed. The very next day, a delegation went to see the Tsar. Military commanders advised him to abdicate. He followed their advice and abdicated on 2nd March. Soviet leaders and Duma leaders formed a provisional government to run the country. Russia's future would be decided by a constituent assembly elected on the basis of universal adult suffrage. Suffrage means the right to vote in political elections. Petrograd had led the February Revolution that brought down the monarchy in February 1917. Okay, do you know what has happened after February Revolution? Army officials, landowners, and industrialists were influential in the provisional government. But the liberals, as well as socialists among them, worked towards an elected government. Restrictions on public meetings and associations were removed. Soviets, like the Petrograd Soviet, were set up everywhere, though no common system of election was followed. Do you know what the April thesis is? In April 1917, the Bolshevik leader Vladimir Lenin returned to Russia from his exile. He and the Bolsheviks had opposed the war since 1914. Now he felt it was time for Soviets to take over power. He declared that the war be brought to a close, land be transferred to the peasants, and banks be nationalized. These three demands were Lenin's April thesis. He also argued that the Bolshevik Party rename itself the Communist Party to indicate its new radical aims. Most others in the Bolshevik Party were initially surprised by the April thesis. They thought that the time was not yet ripe for a socialist revolution and the provisional government needed to be supported. But the developments of the subsequent months changed their attitude. Through the summer, the workers' movement spread. In industrial areas, factory committees were formed which began questioning the way industrialists ran their factories. Trade unions grew in number. Soldiers' committees were formed in the army. In June, about 500 Soviets sent representatives to an all Russian Congress of Soviets. As the provisional government saw its power reduce and Bolshevik influence grow, it decided to take stern measures against the spreading discontent. It resisted attempts by workers to run factories and began arresting leaders. Popular demonstrations staged by the Bolsheviks in July 1917 were sternly repressed. Many Bolshevik leaders had to go into hiding or flee. Meanwhile, in the countryside, peasants and their socialist revolutionary leaders pressed for a redistribution of land. Land committees were formed to handle this. Encouraged by the socialist revolutionaries, peasants seized land between July and September 1917. Now let us try to know about the Revolution of October 1917. As the conflict between the provisional government and the Bolshevik grew, Lenin feared the provisional government would set up a dictatorship. In September, he began discussions for an uprising against the government. Bolshevik supporters in the army, Soviets, and factories were brought together. On 16th October 1917, Lenin persuaded the Petrograd Soviet and the Bolshevik Party to agree to a socialist seizure of power. A military revolutionary committee was appointed by the Soviet under Leon Trotsky to organize the seizure. The date of the event was kept a secret. The uprising began on 24th October. Sensing trouble, Prime Minister Kerensky had left the city to summon troops. At dawn, military men loyal to the government seized the buildings of two Bolshevik newspapers. Pre-government troops were sent to take over telephone and telegraph offices and protect the Winter Palace. In a swift response, the Military Revolutionary Committee ordered its supporters to seize government offices and arrest ministers. Late in the day, the ship Aurora shelled the Winter Palace. Other vessels sailed down the Neva and took over various military points. By nightfall, the city was under the committee's control and the ministers had surrendered. At a meeting of the All Russian Congress of Soviets in Petrograd, the majority approved the Bolshevik action. Uprisings took place in other cities. There was heavy fighting, especially in Moscow, but by December, the Bolsheviks controlled the Moscow Petrograd area. Okay, let us see what changed after October Revolution. The Bolsheviks were totally opposed to private property. Most industry and banks were nationalized in November 1917. This meant that the government took over ownership and management. Land was declared social property, and peasants were allowed to seize the land of the nobility. In cities, Bolsheviks enforced the partition of large houses according to family requirements. They banned the use of the old titles of aristocracy. To assert the change, new uniforms were designed for the army and officials. Following a clothing competition organized in 1918, when the Soviet hat Budinovka was chosen, the Bolshevik Party was renamed the Russian Communist Party. In November 1917, the Bolsheviks conducted the elections to the Constituent Assembly, but they failed to gain majority support. In January 1918, the Assembly rejected Bolshevik measures and Lenin dismissed the Assembly. He thought that all Russian Congress of Soviets was more democratic than an assembly elected in uncertain conditions. In March 1918, despite opposition by their political allies, the Bolsheviks made peace with Germany at Brest-Litovsk. In the years that followed, the Bolsheviks became the only party to participate in the elections to the All Russian Congress of Soviets, which became the parliament of the country. Russia became a one-party state. Trade unions were kept under party control. The secret police called the Chega first and later OGPU and NKVD punished those who criticized the Bolsheviks. Many young writers and artists rallied to the party because it stood for socialism and for change. After October 1917, this led to experiments in the arts and architecture. But many became disillusioned because of the censorship the party encouraged. Okay, now let us recap what we have learned in this session. We have learned about the February Revolution in Petrograd, formation of the Petrograd Soviet, how a provisional government was formed, and what changed after an October Revolution. Now it's time for you to do an activity. Read the two views on the revolution in the countryside as given in box 3, page 40 of the textbook. Imagine yourself to be a witness to the events. Write a short account from the standpoint of an owner of an estate, a small peasant, and a journalist. Okay, meet you in the next session. Thank you.